She has never earned $1 in her life. Darius Whitmore said it the way other men said the weather was fine, casually, over the rim of a crystal glass, to a circle of friends who had gathered in his backyard beneath strings of warm white lights. Naomi Bellamy stood 3 feet away, holding a glass of wine she had not touched in 20 minutes, and she did not flinch. She did not set the glass down harder than necessary. She did not look away or blink back tears the way a wounded woman was supposed to. She simply stood there, calm as still water, while the laughter rose around her like smoke from the outdoor fire pit, curling upward and disappearing into the dark. One of the wives, a woman named Patricia, who wore diamonds the size of small stones, turned to Naomi with a curious, almost pitying tilt of her head and asked whether it was true, whether Naomi truly had never worked a single day in 12 years of marriage. "Is that true?" she asked, and the question hung in the warm night air, like smoke that refused to clear. Naomi took a slow sip of wine before answering, her voice quiet but perfectly even. "He believes it is," she said, and something about the phrasing made the small crowd fall silent for a moment, longer than the joke deserved, though none of them understood why. Darius filled the silence with another laugh, waving his glass toward her, as though presenting a piece of furniture rather than a wife of over a decade. He told the story again, the one about the years she stayed home, embellishing it now with details meant purely for effect, describing lazy mornings and spa afternoons that had never actually existed in the life they shared. Nobody in that circle of lawyers and hedge fund managers and their glittering wives knew that for 12 years, under a name none of them recognized, Naomi had been quietly building an empire. Nobody knew that somewhere in the house behind them, in a locked room at the bottom of the stairs, there sat a safe her husband believed she would never dare to open. That night, after Darius stood in front of his oldest friends and told them his wife had contributed nothing, after he laughed at the years she had spent, as he put it, doing absolutely nothing with her life, Naomi walked back into the house in silence and made her way down into the basement. She found the small brass key in the pocket of her cardigan, the one she had carried for 6 years, without ever once turning it in the lock out of respect for a boundary her husband had drawn. She placed it against the cold metal, and for the first time in 12 years of marriage, she opened the safe. The room downstairs smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of smell that clings to secrets left too long in the dark. Naomi stood in front of the safe for a long moment before she moved, listening to the muffled sound of laughter still drifting down from the yard above, the clink of ice against glass, the low hum of a marriage that had already ended in every way except on paper. Darius had said it so casually in the car ride home, as if he were reading off a grocery list rather than dismantling 12 years of a shared life. He told her the marriage was over. He told her he would keep the house, the one with the wraparound porch she had chosen because it reminded her of her grandmother's home in Savannah. He told her he would keep the accounts, the company, the cars, everything with his name stamped somewhere on the paperwork. And then, without even glancing over at her, he told her she would leave with the only thing she had ever truly contributed to their life together, which was, in his words, a few suitcases of clothes he had paid for. He kept talking, as the streetlights slid past the windshield in long amber streaks, listing off names of attorneys he intended to call in the morning, describing in clinical detail how quickly he expected the process to move once his lawyers filed the paperwork. He seemed almost cheerful about it, the way a man might sound describing a business deal that had finally, after months of negotiation, tilted entirely in his favor. Naomi had looked out the window at the passing streetlights and said nothing at all, because she had learned long ago that silence was not weakness. Silence was simply the space she used to think, and in that space, somewhere between the country club and their front gate, she had already begun composing the first sentence of a plan that had been waiting patiently inside her for years. It had not always been this way between them. When Naomi and Darius first married, he had not looked at her the way he looked at her now, as though she were an inconvenient line item in a budget he no longer wanted to balance. In those early years, he used to tell people she was the smartest person in any room he had ever walked into, and he had meant it, or at least he had believed he meant it, back before ambition curdled something in him that never fully returned to its original shape. As his career climbed, so did his need for control. And somewhere along the way, the money he earned stopped feeling like a resource and started feeling like a leash. Every purchase required an explanation. Every decision, no matter how small, needed his approval before it could move forward. He liked to say it plainly, without any cruelty in his voice, because he did not think of it as cruel at all. I provide, you follow. Naomi had once held a career of her own, a good one, in financial analysis, the kind of position she had worked years to earn. Darius convinced her to leave it behind so she could support his growing business. And she agreed, because in those days, she still believed that partnership meant sacrifice moved in both directions. What Darius never knew, what he could not have imagined, even in his most paranoid moments, was that Naomi never actually stopped working. She simply stopped doing it where he could see. At night, long after he had fallen asleep beside her, she sat awake with her laptop glowing faintly in the dark, teaching herself the language of markets, of equity, of risk and return, piecing together an education no one had handed her. She started small, embarrassingly small, by the standards of the world Darius lived in. A few $100s, moved carefully into an account that bore no trace of his name, no trace of their shared life, nothing that could ever be found by accident. Slowly, patiently, one small investment became two, and two became a portfolio, and the portfolio became something else entirely, something that no longer resembled the quiet, invisible wife everyone believed her to be. She kept her appearance ordinary on purpose. She wore the same cardigans, drove the same modest sedan, said little at the dinner parties where Darius's colleagues traded stories about their portfolios as if trading baseball cards. She learned to nod along when the men in the room talked over her, to let their assumptions about her fill the silence she left behind, because every wrong assumption they made was one more piece of cover she did not have to build herself. There were nights when Darius came home late, smelling of expensive scotch and self-satisfaction, and found her exactly where he expected her to be, in the kitchen or curled up with a magazine, the laptop already closed and tucked away in a drawer. He never thought to check. He never once asked what she did with her days. He never once wondered where the quiet, competent woman he had married had actually gone. She let the world see exactly what it expected to see, because a woman who is underestimated is a woman who is free to move unwatched. And Naomi had come to understand that freedom, real freedom, rarely announced itself. It simply accumulated, one overlooked hour at a time, until one day it was large enough to stand on its own. One evening, months before the night of the party, Naomi had been searching through old files on her laptop when an email surfaced from years earlier, one she had nearly forgotten she'd received. It was short, formal, the kind of message that arrives without fanfare despite carrying enormous weight. "Congratulations, Miss Bellamy," it read. "Your company has officially crossed the $10 million valuation." She remembered reading it the first time, alone in a parked car outside a grocery store, and feeling nothing like triumph, only a strange, quiet steadiness, the sense of a door closing gently somewhere behind her. She had told no one. Not her husband, not her closest friends, only her sister Marlene, who had sworn years ago never to breathe a word of it to anyone, especially not to Darius. Naomi had built something enormous in the shadow of a man who believed shadows were the only place she belonged, and now, standing at the bottom of the basement stairs with the safe's key warm in her palm, she understood that the time for shadows had finally come to an end. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the kind of chill that seemed to seep up from the concrete floor itself. Naomi crossed the room slowly, past boxes of decorations they never used, and furniture from an apartment they had left behind years earlier, until she reached the safe bolted into the far wall. Years before, Darius had warned her never to touch it, his voice carrying a weight she had chosen not to question at the time. "That safe contains things you don't need to know about," he had told her once, and something in his tone had made her decide, in that moment, not to push. She had let the warning sit undisturbed for years, the same way she let so many of his declarations sit undisturbed, filed away rather than confronted. But she remembered another night too, 6 years earlier, when Darius had come home from a late dinner with too much whiskey in his blood and too little caution in his mouth, and he had said something she never forgot. If I ever lose everything, he told her, staring at the ceiling rather than at her, that safe is my insurance. She had not understood the comment then. She understood it now. Naomi turned the key. The lock released with a heavy, mechanical click that seemed far too loud in the silence of the basement. Inside, she did not find only cash, though there was a considerable amount of it bundled neatly in the back corner. She found folders thick with paperwork, contracts bearing signatures she recognized and some she did not, a passport tucked into a manila envelope, a small flash drive taped to the underside of a folder, and a stack of documents related to investment accounts she had never once heard mentioned in 12 years of marriage. Her hands moved carefully, deliberately, the way they always did when she worked, though her heart was beating harder than she wanted to admit even to herself. She photographed each page with her phone before she allowed herself to actually absorb what it said, a habit built from years of handling delicate financial information for people who could not always be trusted to tell the truth. Upstairs, she could still hear faint traces of laughter drifting through the floorboards, the last of Darius's guests lingering near the door, unaware that the foundation of the evening's cruel joke was quietly crumbling in the room beneath their feet. She sat down on the cold floor and began to read, methodically, the way she had trained herself to read anything that mattered, line by line, clause by clause, until the shape of what her husband had built in secret began to take form in front of her. One document in particular made her go still. It was a financial agreement between Darius and a company whose name meant absolutely nothing to her, a name she had never encountered in any conversation, any dinner party, any casual mention over morning coffee. She studied the signature at the bottom and recognized her husband's handwriting immediately, the same careless slant he used to sign birthday cards. He had used a significant portion of what she had always believed to be their shared assets to fund a secret venture, one he had never disclosed, one that existed entirely outside the boundaries of the life they supposedly shared. And then, on the final page, she found something far more disturbing than the agreement itself. There, beside her husband's signature, was another name, one she recognized instantly, one that made the blood drain slowly from her face. Naomi stared at the page for a long time before she finally whispered into the empty basement, "You lied to both of us." She did not panic. She did not cry. Instead, Naomi picked up her phone and called the one person who had never once betrayed her trust in 12 years of careful, secretive planning. Celeste Marrow answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert despite the late hour, the voice of a woman accustomed to emergencies that arrived after midnight. "I opened the safe," Naomi said simply, and Celeste, who had spent the better part of 2 decades as a family and corporate attorney, understood immediately the gravity carried inside those 4 words. She instructed Naomi not to touch another document, not to move a single paper out of place, not to breathe a word of what she had found to anyone, including Darius, until they had spoken in person. The 2 women met the following afternoon in Celeste's office, a quiet space on the 14th floor of a building downtown, where Naomi had visited many times before, under the cover of what Darius believed were simple lunches with a friend. Celeste's assistant brought in coffee, neither woman touched, and for nearly 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper and the occasional click of Celeste's pen against her legal pad as she made notes. Celeste spread the documents across her desk, her expression darkening with each new page she reviewed, occasionally pausing to hold a page up to the light or flip back several pages to compare a signature against an earlier one. She found evidence of transactions Darius had never disclosed. She found signs of assets moved quietly, carefully, in ways designed to avoid detection. Small transfers, timed just below the thresholds that typically drew attention, spread across accounts that, on their own, looked unremarkable. But what Celeste discovered next surprised even her, a woman who was rarely surprised by anything. As she reviewed the full scope of Naomi's own holdings, the ones Naomi had spent years quietly assembling, she realized the scale was far larger than even she had understood. Naomi explained, calmly and without pride, the nature of the company she had built, a financial consulting and investment firm she had grown from almost nothing into something substantial, something with real weight and real reach. Darius had no idea his wife stood behind it. He believed the firm belonged to a distant group of investors he had heard about only secondhand, a name mentioned once or twice at industry events that meant nothing to him. In truth, Naomi was the controlling shareholder, the architect behind every decision the company had ever made. Celeste looked at her for a long moment and finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since the first document crossed her desk. "Why did you hide all of this from him?" she asked, and Naomi answered without hesitation, her voice steady in a way that made the words land even harder. "Because he loved the woman he could control," she said, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the sentence settling into the room like dust after a long silence. Then Celeste slid one more folder across the desk, her expression grave. "There is one problem," she said. "Your husband is preparing to take your company too." Darius moved quickly after the party, filing for divorce with the confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of losing. His attorney sent over a list of demands so thorough it bordered on theatrical, claiming the house, both vehicles, every investment account with either of their names attached, and a series of assets Naomi had never even realized he tracked so carefully, down to a piece of jewelry her own mother had given her before she died. He told mutual friends, with a shrug and a small laugh, that Naomi did not have any income worth mentioning, that she did not even understand how money truly worked, that she had spent 12 years existing comfortably inside a life he alone had built. He began appearing at restaurants around the city with a woman none of their friends recognized, making little effort to hide it, as though the appearance of moving on so easily was itself another way of proving he had lost nothing of real value. Naomi heard about it secondhand, from Marlene, who delivered the news carefully, watching her sister's face for some sign of pain that never actually surfaced. Naomi allowed him to believe every word of it, every rumor, every careless boast whispered across a dinner table to people who would inevitably repeat it back to her. She offered no rebuttal, no public correction, no flicker of anger that might have given him pause. She let Darius walk forward, convinced he was winning a war she had not yet begun to fight, because she understood something about her husband that no one else in his circle seemed to grasp. Overconfidence made him careless, and carelessness, given enough time, always left a trail. While Darius celebrated prematurely with his attorneys, Celeste worked quietly behind the scenes, gathering the threads that would eventually become an unbreakable case. The documents from the safe proved to be the foundation of everything that followed. Naomi discovered, through careful review of old statements, that Darius had begun quietly transferring funds out of several joint accounts in the weeks leading up to his announcement, moving money into accounts structured to appear as though they belonged solely to him. He had gone so far as to fabricate documentation suggesting certain shared investments had always been his alone, a lie built on paperwork he assumed no one would ever bother to examine closely. Naomi did not confront him. She did not send an angry message or demand an explanation. Instead, she spent her evenings quietly reviewing bank statements and shareholder agreements at her sister's kitchen table, where she had been staying since the announcement of the divorce, Marlene often sitting across from her with 2 cups of tea, slowly going cold as they worked through the details together. She simply watched and waited, because she understood that Darius, in his rush to secure everything he believed he deserved, was inching closer to a mistake far larger than any small transfer of funds. That mistake arrived one evening in the form of a text message from a name Naomi had not expected to hear from. "I need to talk to you," the message read. "Darius doesn't know I know." Grant Holloway had been Darius's business partner for nearly a decade, a steady, quiet man who had always treated Naomi with more warmth than her husband ever seemed to notice or appreciate. He had a habit, she remembered, of pulling out her chair at dinner parties when Darius was too distracted talking business to bother, small gestures that had never meant much to her at the time, but that she found herself thinking about now, in this new context, as evidence of a decency that had apparently survived a decade in her husband's orbit. When they met the following day at a small coffee shop, far from anywhere either of their social circles frequented, tucked into a corner booth away from the windows, Grant looked visibly shaken, a man carrying something he did not know how to safely set down. He kept turning his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it, his eyes darting toward the door each time it opened, as though he expected Darius to walk in and catch him in the act of telling the truth. He told Naomi that Darius had been attempting to sell off a significant portion of their shared company, a portion he did not fully legally own, at least not without the consent of partners who had never been consulted. Grant slid a folder across the table, and inside Naomi found a contract bearing her husband's familiar, careless signature. She studied it carefully and realized immediately what Darius apparently had not: that he lacked the authority to execute the transaction described within those pages because true controlling interest in that particular arm of the business had, through a series of investments made years earlier under a name Darius never bothered to trace, belonged to Naomi all along. Grant stared at her, stunned, and finally asked the question written plainly across his face. "Did you know your husband was trying to sell what belonged to you?" he asked. And Naomi answered honestly. "I knew he would eventually try," she said, because she had watched him for years, had learned the particular shape of his ambition, had understood that a man who believes he owns everything eventually reaches for things that were never his to take. Naomi explained to Grant, calmly and without bitterness, that she had spent years observing her husband, learning the rhythms of his overconfidence, understanding that the more convinced he became of his own control over her, the more careless he grew with the details that actually mattered. She told him about the safe, about the documents she had found, about the name on the final page that had made her hands go cold in that basement weeks earlier, though she stopped short of revealing every detail, holding certain pieces of the story close, the way she had learned to hold everything close over the years. Grant listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in front of him, and when she finished, he sat with that information for a long moment, before making a decision that would change the direction of everything that followed. He thought about the years he had spent building a business, alongside a man he believed he understood, the countless dinners and late nights and handshake agreements that had once felt like the foundation of a genuine friendship. He chose to stand beside Naomi, not out of any financial motive, but because he had finally seen clearly the shape of a man he had trusted for years, a man who had been willing to betray even the people who believed in him most. "There is a board meeting tomorrow," Grant told her before they parted ways. "Darius thinks he owns the room." Naomi allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile she had permitted herself in weeks. "Then let him walk in believing that," she said, and Grant understood in that moment that he was witnessing the opening move of something far larger than either of them had anticipated. The morning of the board meeting arrived cold and bright, the kind of clear autumn light that made every surface in the glass-walled conference room seem sharper than usual. Darius walked in with the easy confidence of a man who had already spent the money in his mind, trailed by his attorney and a folder of paperwork, outlining a restructuring plan he believed would cement his sole control over the company. He greeted the other partners warmly, shook hands, made the kind of small jokes men make when they believe the outcome of a meeting has already been decided in their favor. He set his folder down at the head of the table, the seat he always chose, the seat that had, for years, seemed to belong to him by some unspoken agreement no one had ever actually made. He glanced at his watch twice in the first 5 minutes, impatient to begin, eager to move through the formalities so he could finally announce the changes he had been planning for weeks in private. He did not expect Naomi to attend. In all the years of their marriage, she had never once inserted herself into his professional world, and he assumed, wrongly, that her absence from his business affairs would extend naturally into this final chapter of their separation. The door opened just as the meeting was set to begin, and Naomi walked in wearing a simple gray suit, no jewelry beyond her wedding ring, which she had chosen deliberately to wear one final time. No entourage, no dramatic entrance, just the quiet certainty of a woman who had waited a very long time for this particular morning to arrive. Celeste followed a step behind her, carrying a slim leather portfolio, and Grant, already seated near the far end of the table, rose slightly from his chair in a small, quiet gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by the other partners in the room. A few of them exchanged glances, unsure exactly who this woman was or why her arrival seemed to shift the temperature of the room so immediately, though none of them said a word as she crossed to an empty chair directly across from her husband and sat down without hurry. Darius laughed when he saw her, a short, dismissive sound that carried across the room. "This isn't your meeting," he said, glancing toward his attorney, as though expecting agreement. Naomi crossed the room without hurry and placed a thin folder on the table directly in front of him. "Actually, Darius," she said, "it is." For a moment, nothing in the room moved. Darius's smile faltered, then hardened into something closer to confusion, as his attorney reached for the folder and began flipping through its contents, his expression shifting from professional composure into something far more uncertain. Naomi began speaking, calmly, methodically, laying out ownership structures Darius had never bothered to investigate. Transactions he had assumed no one would ever trace back to their source, and terms buried deep in old agreements that he had signed years earlier without fully understanding what he had actually agreed to. Darius attempted to argue, his voice rising slightly, insisting there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding, until Celeste stepped forward and placed the original documents on the table beside Naomi's folder, documents pulled directly from the safe he believed no one would ever open. "Your wife isn't asking for half of the company, Mr. Whitmore," Celeste said, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence that had settled over the room. "She already owns it." What followed in that conference room was not loud. It was not the kind of confrontation Darius might have imagined in his worst moments, full of shouting and thrown accusations. It was quiet, precise, devastating in its calm. Darius accused Naomi of deception, his voice tightening with each passing second, as the weight of the documents in front of him became impossible to dismiss. He pushed back from the table slightly, as though putting physical distance between himself and the evidence might somehow diminish its authority. "This is absurd," he said, looking around the room for support that no longer seemed to be there. "You expect these people to believe you built something like this without me knowing." For the first time since the party months earlier, Naomi allowed herself to look at him directly, without flinching, without softening the truth for his comfort. "You called me worthless because you never bothered to look closely," she told him, her voice steady, even as the room around them held its breath. Darius demanded to know why she had hidden so much from him for so many years. His voice rising now, no longer able to maintain the composure he had walked in with. "If this is real," he said, "why would you keep it from your own husband?" Naomi answered him honestly, without cruelty, though the truth landed with more weight than cruelty ever could have managed. "Because every time you thought I had nothing," she said, "you showed me exactly who you were." She let the sentence sit in the air for a moment, before continuing, her voice never once rising above the calm, measured tone she had carried into the room. "Every time you reminded me that you provided and I simply followed, I understood a little more clearly what would happen to anything I built if I ever let you see it too soon." The documents from the safe were laid out one by one across the table, each page another piece of evidence confirming the pattern of hidden transactions and quiet betrayals Darius had constructed over the years. Several of the partners in the room, men who had known Darius for a decade or more, began exchanging glances that made clear their loyalty was shifting in real time, one of them quietly closing the folder Darius had brought in that morning, as though it no longer mattered at all. Darius tried, briefly, to redirect blame toward Grant, suggesting some kind of conspiracy against him, his voice edged with something close to panic now. "You put her up to this," he said, turning on his old friend with an accusation that surprised no one more than himself. But Grant simply produced the original contract Darius had attempted to execute without authorization, sliding it calmly across the table, and the accusation collapsed as quickly as it had been raised. Cornered and increasingly desperate, Darius reached for the only weapon he believed he still had left. He turned to the room and announced that Naomi herself had hidden assets throughout their marriage, that whatever she claimed to own now had likely been built through deception equal to his own. He expected the accusation to land the way accusations always had in their marriage, unquestioned, immediately believed. Instead, Naomi remained perfectly still because she had known this moment was coming long before Darius ever opened his mouth to speak it. Celeste rose from her seat with the calm authority of someone who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. "We expected you to make that accusation," she said, and the room seemed to lean forward slightly, waiting. Celeste methodically walked the room, through every asset Naomi had built over the past 12 years, demonstrating with document after document that every investment, every account, every dollar had been earned and reported through entirely legitimate means. She moved through the paperwork with the unhurried precision of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment dozens of times in her mind, anticipating every objection before it could be raised. Taxes had been filed properly at every stage, each return cross-referenced and stamped, each filing bearing dates that stretched back nearly a decade. Investments had been documented and disclosed exactly as the law required, structured through channels that any forensic accountant could trace within a matter of hours. There was no fraud buried anywhere in Naomi's history, no hidden account structured to deceive anyone, nothing resembling the pattern of secrecy Darius had spent years constructing on his own side of the ledger. By contrast, the records pulled from his own accounts told an entirely different story, one filled with undisclosed transfers, unreported transactions, and financial maneuvers designed specifically to obscure the truth from both his business partners and his wife. One partner, an older man named Whitfield, who had known Darius since business school, set down the page he had been reading and looked at him with an expression that had curdled somewhere between disappointment and disbelief. "Is this true, Darius?" he asked quietly, and Darius did not answer, because for the first time in the entire meeting, he seemed to understand that there was no version of an answer that would help him now. His composure finally broke entirely. He turned toward Naomi, his voice cracking with something between fury and disbelief, insisting that she had destroyed his entire life, that she had planned this humiliation for months, simply to watch him fall in front of people whose respect he had spent years earning. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, there was no anger left in her voice at all, only a quiet, tired clarity. "I didn't destroy your life," she said. Then, after a pause that stretched long enough for every person in the room to feel its weight, she added, "I stopped protecting the illusion you built." Darius's composure finally broke entirely. He turned toward Naomi, his voice cracking with something between fury and disbelief, insisting that she had destroyed his entire life. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, there was no anger left in her voice at all, only a quiet, tired clarity. "I didn't destroy your life," she said. Then, after a pause that stretched long enough for every person in the room to feel its weight, she added, "I stopped protecting the illusion you built." In that moment, Darius understood something he would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to fully accept. The woman he had spent years dismissing, mocking in front of friends, reducing to a footnote in the story of his own success, had quietly become the most powerful person in the room. The divorce proceedings that followed moved swiftly once the truth had been laid bare before witnesses who could no longer pretend otherwise. Darius did not receive the house, the accounts, or the company he had once been so certain belonged entirely to him. Naomi retained what was legally and rightfully hers, built patiently across more than a decade of careful, invisible labor. She did not seek to destroy what remained of Darius's career or reputation beyond what the truth itself had already done. She sought only to end the control he had held over her for so long, nothing more and nothing less. Grant had offered, at one point during the proceedings, to help push for a harsher settlement, one that would have left Darius with almost nothing. But Naomi declined, telling him simply that she was not interested in becoming a version of the person who had once tried to erase her. Celeste respected the decision. Even if she privately believed Darius deserved far less mercy than he ultimately received, and the final agreement, though favorable to Naomi in every material sense, left Darius with enough to rebuild something, if he chose to. On the day the final papers were signed, the two of them found themselves alone for a brief moment in the hallway outside the attorney's office, the first time they had stood that close to one another, without lawyers or witnesses between them since the night of the party. Darius lingered near the door, his usual confidence entirely gone, replaced by something smaller and far more uncertain, a version of himself Naomi had not seen since the earliest days of their marriage, before success had taught him to mistake control for love. He asked her one final question before she walked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. And Naomi stood there for a long moment, searching for an answer honest enough to give him. turning the question over in her mind, the way she once turned over the smallest financial decisions late at night when no one was watching. She thought of the early years, of the man who had once called her the smartest person he had ever met, and she thought of everything that man had slowly, deliberately allowed himself to become. In the end, she chose silence as her response, the same silence she had carried through the worst of their marriage, though this time it meant something entirely different, no longer a shield, but simply the truth, offered in the only language that felt honest enough to hold it. Naomi returned to the house one final time before it was sold, walking through rooms that no longer felt like they belonged to her, if they ever truly had. The movers had already come and gone, leaving behind only the faint outlines on the carpet, where furniture had once stood for over a decade, pale rectangles marking the shape of a life that no longer existed. She walked slowly through the kitchen, past the counter, where she used to sit each morning, listening to Darius describe his plans for the day, without ever once asking about hers, and out into the hallway where family photographs had hung for years, the nails still visible in the plaster like small, quiet scars. She made her way down to the basement one last time, to the room where everything had changed the night she finally turned that small brass key. The safe stood open now, exactly as she had left it weeks earlier, no longer carrying the same weight of fear or mystery it once held over her. She reached inside and retrieved not the cash, not the folders of contracts, not even the flash drive that had once seemed so important, but a single sheet of paper tucked into the very back corner, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. It was the very first financial plan she had ever written for herself, drafted late one night more than a decade earlier, when her entire portfolio consisted of a few $100s and a stubborn, quiet determination that no one else knew existed. She stood there, reading her own handwriting, evidence that everything she had built had started from almost nothing, built one careful decision at a time, in the hours when no one was watching. She remembered the words Darius had said to her so many times over the years, the same phrase repeated in different forms until it had almost become a kind of curse. "You'll never earn $1," he used to say, and she had let him believe it, because a woman underestimated is a woman left free to build in peace. Naomi opened her laptop one final time in that basement, the glow of the screen, the only light in the cold, quiet room. Her company's account balance appeared on the screen, a number large enough that it would have silenced every person who had ever laughed at her in that backyard months earlier. But Naomi did not smile because of the number itself. She smiled because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she no longer felt the need to prove her worth to anyone at all. Not to Darius, not to his friends, not to the version of herself who had once stayed quiet, simply to keep the peace. Her phone rang as she climbed the basement stairs for the last time, Celeste's voice warm and familiar on the other end. "What are you going to do now?" Celeste asked, and Naomi paused at the top of the stairs, looking out through the kitchen window at the pale morning light spreading slowly across the yard. "Build something I don't have to hide," she said. And in that single sentence, 12 years of careful, quiet survival finally gave way to something entirely new. In the weeks after the settlement was finalized, Naomi found herself relearning the shape of her own days, discovering how strange it felt to make decisions that no longer required an explanation to anyone but herself. She moved into a smaller house on the edge of town, one she chose entirely on her own, with a kitchen that caught the morning light in a way that reminded her, faintly, of the home she had grown up in. Marlene helped her unpack the few boxes she had taken from the old house, mostly books and photographs, almost nothing that had once belonged to the life she shared with Darius. Her sister asked her once, gently, whether she felt any regret about how everything had unfolded, and Naomi considered the question honestly before answering. "The only regret I have," she said, "is that I let him believe the lie for as long as I did." Marlene did not push further, understanding that some answers needed time to fully settle before they could be spoken aloud in any greater detail. In the months that followed, Naomi made a decision that surprised almost everyone who had once known her only as Darius Whitmore's quiet, unremarkable wife. She stepped forward publicly as the founder and controlling owner of the company she had spent over a decade building from nothing, no longer content to let her success exist only in the shadows where Darius had always assumed she belonged. The announcement drew attention from local business journals, several of which requested interviews she had once would have declined without a second thought. She agreed to a handful of them, speaking plainly about the years of quiet work behind the company's growth, careful never to mention Darius by name, because his part in her story, she had decided, no longer deserved the space. Grant remained by her side as a trusted partner, one of the few people who had witnessed both her downfall and her rise and chosen, without hesitation, to stand on the right side of that history. Marlene, who had carried her sister's secret faithfully for years, without ever once revealing it, stood proudly beside her at the small gathering held to mark the company's next chapter, a chapter written entirely under Naomi's own name for the very first time. Celeste, ever composed, ever precise, watched from the back of the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped guide a long, careful plan to its rightful conclusion. On the morning of the company's public announcement, Naomi stood outside the tall glass building that housed the firm she had built in silence for so many years, watching as workers finished installing new signage above the entrance, her name printed clearly across the board for the very first time. She had chosen the font herself, simple and unadorned, nothing that called attention to itself beyond the plain fact of its presence. A small crowd of employees had gathered near the entrance, some of whom had worked for the company for years, without ever once meeting the woman whose decisions had shaped nearly every major turn in its history. A young employee approached her nervously, clipboard in hand, and asked if she was ready to step inside for the announcement. Naomi looked up at the building, at the sunlight catching against the glass, at everything she had built without permission from a man who once believed permission was his to give. She thought briefly of the basement, of the cold concrete floor and the small brass key, of every quiet hour she had spent building something no one believed she was capable of building. "I've been ready for 12 years, she said, and stepped through the doors without looking back. Darius, somewhere across town, would spend the following months piecing together a life stripped of the illusions he had built it upon, forced finally to reckon with the truth of who he had actually been married to all along. Word of the boardroom meeting had traveled quickly through the circles he once considered his own, and the friends who had laughed so easily at his jokes about Naomi grew noticeably quieter whenever her name came up in conversation now. He had believed, for years, that the safe in his basement held nothing more than his own private insurance against a future he feared. He had been wrong. The safe had never protected him at all. It had simply waited, patiently, for the one person he never expected to open it, holding inside it, not his secret, but the quiet, undeniable proof of the illusion he had spent his entire marriage constructing, an illusion that finally, irreversibly, belonged to no one but him. And somewhere across the city, in an office with her name freshly painted on the door, Naomi Bellamy sat down at her desk for the first time, as exactly who she had always been, no longer hidden, no longer waiting, no longer required to prove to anyone that she had, in fact, earned every single dollar herself.